And welcome to the latest Innovators video, Innovator number 9. I want you to do me a favour. Take approximately 4.5 minutes time out from your life, or whatever you're doing right now. Press pause on this video and sit and listen intently to the environment around you, and return to me once you've done so. Welcome back. You've just experienced what is Innovator number 9's most famous and controversial composition. You may think that it's a joke, but if you take a minute to consider this, how do you define a music composition when there is no apparent evidence of instruments or structure? Composed as a sound experience, Innovator number 9 was interested in the idea of chants playing a role in composition, in order not to fall into predetermined musical forms or cliches, such as harmonic chord clusters or scales. In this composition, as Larry Solomon describes, chants was used to free the composer from controlling sounds and exercising his personal tastes and choices, his memories, his likes and dislikes. Alongside this, probably his most famous composition, during his 60-year career he has also been viewed as an artist, philosopher, theorist and writer. His listed works total over 330, comprising of 181 musical works, 9 graphic works, and with 9 books completed during his career, written solo or in collaboration. His impact on modern music composition and how it can be appreciated and acknowledged cannot be denied. TheArtStory.org state that he is best known for revolutionizing modern music through his incorporation of unconventional instrumentation and the idea of environmental music dictated by chants. He redefined how many of us think about music and musical content. In a lecture in 1937, he predicted that the special function of electrical instruments will be to provide complete control of the overtone structure of tones, as opposed to noises, and make these tones in any frequency, amplitude, and duration. This at a time when the recording industry was still in its infancy and electrical instruments were limited. For example, the electric guitar had barely been invented, and the synthesizer would not be developed commercially for another 30 years. Seen as a radical throughout his career and often not given the recognition he deserved, more often described by critics as a philosopher, we should be mindful that Innovator number 9 was first and foremost a composer not only of music, but also of words, concepts and ideas. Welcome to the world of John Cage. John Cage was an inquisitive child brought up in a bohemian atmosphere by his parents, where he was exposed to a number of radical ideas, thoughts and interests. He learnt piano in his early teens and excelled at school. In 1928 he completed his graduation from the Los Angeles High School and enrolled at the Pomona College, Claremont, and studied there till 1930, and then dropped out after deciding he was going to be a writer. Cage went to Europe thinking himself a writer, but after a few piano lessons at the Paris Conservatory and a year wandering around Europe and North Africa with his friend Don Sample, Cage returned to Los Angeles in 1932, a composer of mathematically constructed scores, but also a painter. During the early 1930s, Cage met a number of people whose influence and interests led him to study under the composers Henry Cowell and Adolf Weiss. Cowell suggested John take lessons from Arnold Schoenberg. Schoenberg was an Austrian-American composer and one of the most influential music teachers in the early 20th century. He created new methods of musical composition involving atonality, namely serialism and the 12-tone row, breaking away from the traditions of classical music that had been imposed for centuries on composers. In Cage's autobiographical statement, he says, "When I asked Schoenberg to teach me, he said, 'You probably can't afford my price.' I said, 'Don't mention it, I don't have any money.' He said, 'Will you devote your life to music?' This time I said yes. He said he would teach me free of charge." Struggling to appreciate Schoenberg's approach to harmony, after 2 years of study, Cage decided to leave. The next few years saw Cage switching from job to job until he settled on one, as a dance accompanist at UCLA, where he also created music for choreographies and taught a program on musical accompaniments for rhythmic expression. This would lead him on to Seattle at the Cornish College as a composer and accompanist. It was in Seattle he claimed to have invented the prepared piano, in which he inserted nuts and bolts, screws and rubber erasers at different points inside the piano. As explained by Mark Swed of the Los Angeles Times, this radically changed the nature of the piano, turning it into a gently startling one-man percussion band, and it was one of the things for which he became known. In 1939, Cage composed the first of a series of live performance works called Imaginary Landscapes, which were to be performed with conventional instruments and electronic devices. While working in Seattle, Cage experimented with the electronic equipment for the recording studio at the Cornish School and composed a part for Imaginary Landscape No. 1 that required disc recordings to be performed on a variable speed record player. In the summer of 1941, Cage left Seattle to teach at the Chicago School of Design, and whilst there he also worked at the University of Chicago as a composer and accompanist. Although well appreciated by audiences and critics, Cage thought there would be more opportunities in New York, and so moved there in the spring of 1942. Initially, Cage's reputation gained him favour there, and he was introduced to artists such as Max Ernst, Marcel Duchamp, Pierre Mondrian, and Jackson Pollock, amongst many others. He received enormous support from the arts patron Peggy Guggenheim. However, this support was short-lived when Cage signed another contract for a show at the Museum of Modern Art, so Guggenheim stopped all her support. Thus, though Cage's concert at the Guggenheim Museum was successful, he was actually left unemployed and penniless. In 1946, he agreed to teach Gita Sarabhai, an Indian musician who had come to the US to learn Western music, and in return, John asked her to teach him about Indian music and philosophy. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, he also attended the lectures on Zen Buddhism. The study of Indian and Buddhist philosophies inspired him to compose many works like the Sonatas and Interludes for prepared piano and String Quartet in 4 parts. In 1950, Cage began an association with the Wesleyan University and worked within its music department up until his death in 1992. During this period, Cage had become interested in Eastern philosophies, especially in Zen, from which he gained a treasuring of non-intention. Working to remove creative choice from composition, he used coin tosses to determine events. Music of Changes for Piano, 1951. He wrote for 12 radios. Imaginary Landscape No. 4, also 1951. His 4 minutes 33 seconds, from 1952, has no sound added to it, that of the environment in which it is performed. The Concert for Piano and Orchestra, from 1958, is an encyclopedia of indeterminate notations. Yet other works show his growing interest in the theatre of musical performance, such as Water Music 1952, for pianist with a variety of non-standard equipment, and also his interest in electronics, Imaginary Landscape No. 5 for randomly mixed recordings in 1952, and Cartridge Music for small sounds amplified in live performance from 1960. In 1961, Wesleyan University Press issued Silence, which was a set of John's lectures and writings on a wide range of topics comprising the well-known Lecture on Nothing. Lecture on Nothing was first presented to an audience in 1950. This was a lecture delivered as a poem culminating in the concept of nothing or no thing, but rather of the notion of experience. The lecture, when presented in the book Silence, shows the intention of the delivery, including pauses. It was a demonstration of rhythmic structure applied to the spoken word. James Pritchett, in The Music of John Cage, points out that Lecture on nothing is an extension of the idea of micro-macro cosmic structure, i.e., the idea of creating an open space of temporal structure where any and everything can happen within a structured duration. Alongside other works by Cage, this was part of the exploration of chance, silence and space as a precursor to his composition 433. Returning to probably his most famous piece, 433, Cage in his book Silence, Lectures and Writings argued that there is no such thing as an empty space or empty time. There is always something to see, something to hear. In fact, try as we may to make a silence, we cannot. As explained by Larry Solomon, he redefined silence as simply the absence of intended sounds or the turning off of our awareness. Cage first began exploring the idea of composing a piece that contained no specific musical instructions but rather silence in 1947. However, it was not until 1952 that the composition was fully formed. Why would anybody write music in which nothing is performed? Some people assume that Cage did it just to shock. Others have regarded it as a deliberate affront or insult, either to the audience or as an attack on music as an art form, whilst others thought it was just the act of a fool or that it was just too easy and he was being too clever. But it was composed after 5 long years of careful deliberation. Cage said, "I knew it would be taken as a joke and a renunciation of work, whereas I also knew that if it was done, it would be of the highest form of work." Cage believed that art and life should not be separate but one and the same. He said that art is not an escape from life but rather an introduction to it. He also stated, "It is time to turn the environment into art." These thoughts brought him to the concept of interpenetration. Cage believed music could no longer be considered new or experimental unless it incorporated interpenetration. Previously, sounds that were outside the composer's intentions were considered unwelcome noises, but in the words of Larry Solomon, works that welcome and include sounds outside of the composer's and performer's intentions are those that include interpenetration. Cage's interests in the I Ching also provided him with approaches to composition using chants, and this consideration also played its part in the formulation and conception of 433. 433 is the ultimate composition featuring interpenetration, as it is framed by a start and finish, usually monitored by a stopwatch, but can contain any sound that occurs within the time allocated to the performance. For example, the first performance was by pianist David Tudor in Woodstock, New York on August 29, 1952. Tudor walked onto the stage, sat at the piano and placed the handwritten score, which was in conventional notation, with blank measures in 3 movements, on the piano. Tudor signalled the commencement of the piece by lowering the keyboard lid of the piano and sat motionless as he used a stopwatch to measure the time of each movement. He finally raised the piano lid to signify the end. The score, written for, and I quote, "for any instrument or combination of instruments," indicated 3 silent movements, each of a different length, but when added together totalled 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The composition gives opportunity to divine influences, i.e. the sounds that are not made intentionally, but are already there around us, free to be heard and free to penetrate the art. Thus nature and life literally become the art, echoing the statements Cage made about life, art, and the environment being one. Kyle Gann stated in his book No Such Thing as Silence, John Cage's 433, as an act of enclosing environmental and unintended sounds in a moment of attention in order to open the mind to the fact that all sounds are music. Alex Ross, writing in The New Yorker, states that Nearly 6 decades after the work came into the world, 433 is still dismissed as absolutely ridiculous, stupid, a gimmick by some people. So why is John Cage important and deserves the title Innovator Number 9? His predictions in the 1930s that electronic instruments would be able to produce any conceivable sound and would dominate music production was prophetic. His experiments in different forms of composition in order to explore how music could be written presented new approaches and understanding to music production and performance. He challenged the status quo and influenced countless forms of new music, particularly within the electronic music scene and musicians as well. Kyle Gann makes a persuasive case that 433 effectively split open the musical scene of the mid-20th century. He writes, "Listening to or merely thinking about 433 led composers to listen to phenomena that would have formerly been considered non-musical, i.e., sustained tones, repeating patterns, other murmurs of the mechanical world." Cage cleared the way for minimalism, even if he showed that he had little sympathy for it when it came along. He also spurred the emergence of ambient music, sound art, and other forms of relating sound to particular spaces. Larry Solomon argues, 433 continues to baffle and confound people today. It has become an icon of the modern era, at once synonymous with Cage in the popular imagination, and Cage with it. He also states, 433 requires a serious, reverent, focused and open mind that is willing to put aside preconceptions and embrace the universe of sound as music. As Cage said himself, if you develop an ear for sounds that are musical, it is like developing an ego. You begin to refuse sounds that are not musical, and that way cut yourself off from a good deal of experience. Mark Prendergast in The Ambient Century suggests that, for Cage, by objectifying art and eliminating purpose, he raised the ideal of music composition to a new spiritual plane. In Modulations, A History of Electronic Music, John Cage is described as probably the most intellectually stimulating modern composer. Cage interrogated fixed ideas of time, space, noise, and what constituted art. I'll leave the final words to John Cage from his book Silence, where he posited the argument. Which is more musical, a truck passing by a factory or a truck passing by a music school? Are the people inside the school musical and the ones outside unmusical? What if the ones inside can't hear very well? Would that change my question? Thanks for watching. See you next time.